Kesha Campbell knew the smell of exhaustion like one knows an unwanted old friend. At 18, only 6 months fresh from Jamaica, her life in the Bronx was a marathon without a finish line. It was 16 hours a day, divided between a greasy diner kitchen and cleaning offices she could never dream of attending during the day. Every bone in her body ached, but that pain was the fuel that pushed her onto the subway car towards Manhattan. Inside her battered backpack, along with a pair of cheap boxing gloves, was the scholarship flyer for the Sterling Boxing Academy. That wasn't just paper, it was the only sliver of light in a tunnel that seemed endless, the promise that her future could be bigger than the smell of frying oil embedded in her clothes. As she pushed open the heavy glass doors of the gym, the air that greeted her was from another planet. The smell of new leather, expensive cleaning products, and a different, almost perfumed kind of sweat hit her full force. This place wasn't just a gym, it was a sanctuary for the rich and powerful, a castle of steel and mirrors where Manhattan's Olympian gods came to sculpt their bodies. And at that exact moment, the queen of that Olympus, Victoria Sterling, was at the center of it all. Kesha immediately felt small, a blur of reality amidst so much shine. Her worn clothes, the tiredness etched on her face, everything about her seemed to scream that she didn't belong there, a feeling her heart stubbornly tried to ignore, but her eyes couldn't deny. Victoria Sterling wasn't training, she was performing. Every movement was calculated not for efficiency, but for the aesthetic of cruelty. Her blonde hair, tied in a pristine ponytail, whipped through the air with each jab she threw against the punching bag. A bag that, in her mind, bore the faces of all her rivals. Around her, a small entourage of admirers and sycophants laughed at her jokes and recorded every second with their latest generation cell phones. It was then that her hawk-like gaze, trained to detect any imperfection in her realm, landed on Kesha. The champion stopped, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her perfectly sculpted lips. She leaned towards her friend, an equally sculpted blonde, and whispered something. The omniscient narrator knows the exact words were, "Look what the charity program dragged in." The laughter that followed was low, but it cut through the air like broken glass, making Kesha feel every eye turn towards her. In that instant, she was no longer a scholarship candidate. She was an insect under a magnifying glass, about to be burned by the sun of others' arrogance. The heat of shame rose up her neck, but beneath it, an ancient, almost forgotten ember of pure fury threatened to ignite. With the posture of a queen approaching a commoner, Victoria glided across the gym, her steps silent and filled with unquestionable authority. She stopped inches from Kesha, looking her up and down, the contempt in her blue eyes, so tangible it could almost be touched. "So, you're our little social experiment," Victoria said, her voice loud enough for the entire gym to hear. "Straight from the jungles of Jamaica to learn how civilized people behave. Lovely." Every word was a punch, stronger than any Kesha had ever taken. She wanted to reply, wanted to scream, but the words were stuck in her throat, choked by the weight of that public humiliation. "You know," Victoria continued with a false tone of generosity, "for you to have a real chance here, you need to show you can take a hit. How about some friendly sparring? You and me, just to see what you're made of." The offer hung in the air, but it wasn't a choice. It was an ultimatum. Victoria already imagined the scene. The massacre, the tears, and the video going viral, solidifying her image as an untouchable queen. Trapped between the annihilation of her dream and the certainty of her humiliation, Kesha merely nodded, an almost imperceptible movement that sealed her fate and made Victoria's smile widen even further. The gym transformed into a modern arena. The hum of treadmills and the thud of punching bags ceased, replaced by a silence heavy with expectation and malice. Dozens of cell phones rose into the air, lenses pointed at the ring like weapons ready to fire and capture the impending carnage. Victoria, the great star, savored every second of that attention. She put on her gloves with theatrical slowness, smiling for the cameras, already. Imagining the captions she would use on Instagram, giving a welcome lesson to our charity project. Some dreams simply weren't meant to come true. For her, it was pure entertainment, guaranteed viral content that would reassert her superior status. Meanwhile, Kesha climbed the steps to the ring with the weight of the world on her shoulders. Each step creaked in her worn sneakers, a pathetic sound amidst the oppressive silence. She didn't fear physical pain, for pain was her daily companion, but she felt the crushing weight of humiliation and the breaking of a sacred promise made to her mother on her deathbed that she would never again use her fists in that dirty, desperate way of the streets of Kingston. Just as the makeshift referee, one of Victoria's fawning trainers, was about to signal the start of the friendly massacre, the gym's glass doors burst open with a jolt, breaking the hypnotic tension of the environment. A middle-aged man in simple work clothes and a face marked by weariness and determination entered the premises. It was Winston, Kesha's uncle. His presence was as glaring an anomaly as his niece's. He carried the smell of workshop grease and raw reality, a brutal contrast to the perfume of wealth that permeated the air. The gym owner, a businessman named Arthur Donovan, whose primary interest was the shine the sterling name brought to his brand, impatiently motioned for security to remove him. But Winston was not intimidated. His eyes swept the room, ignoring the crowd and the arrogant champion, and landed on Kesha, huddled in her corner of the ring. The concern on his face transformed into a mask of cold, protective fury. Ignoring the approaching security guards, he marched directly to Donovan with an urgency that made the businessman take a step back. "You will not let this fight happen," Winston said, his voice low, but charged with the force of distant thunder. "You have no idea who you've put in there to be your champion's toy, Arthur." Donovan's arrogance was a fortress, built with years of success and flattery. "I don't know who you think you are," he began, his voice cold and cutting, "but you have 10 seconds to get off my property before I call the police." From the ring, Victoria's voice rang out, impatient and spoiled. "Dad, get this trash out of here. He's ruining my recording." The word "dad" confirmed the power dynamic, but Winston did not back down. On the contrary, he moved even closer, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial and urgent whisper, forcing the powerful Donovan to lean in to hear. "The name on her papers is Kesha Campbell, yes, but that's not her real name, not the name that matters. In the alleys of Trenchtown, in Kingston where we come from, she's known by another name, a name that grown men, street fighters triple her size, learn to fear. They call her Lightning, because before you realize the storm has arrived, you're already on the ground, not knowing what hit you." The way Winston pronounced the nickname, with a mixture of reverence and pain, sent a shiver down Donovan's spine, who instinctively looked at the frail, cornered figure in the ring. Donovan's mind, accustomed to calculating risks and profits, struggled to process the information. He saw the trembling girl, and he saw the convinced man in front of him, and the story simply didn't fit. "That's ridiculous," he murmured, but the certainty in his voice had disappeared. Winston continued, painting a picture that the luxury gym could never conceive. "She's not a rookie looking for a chance, Mr. Donovan. She's a retired legend at 18. Since she was 12, she fought. Not in rings with padded gloves and rules. She fought in dirt yards, in abandoned warehouses, against men who had nothing to lose. She didn't fight for trophies. She fought for the betting money so that my sister and I, her mother, would have something to eat. She fought to pay for medicine when my sister got sick. She promised her on her deathbed that she would stop, that she would come to America and use her strength to build something, not to destroy. She came here seeking dignity, not violence." The shock on Arthur Donovan's face was profound. He was no longer looking at a social experiment. He was looking at a dangerous secret, a lethal weapon his arrogant daughter, out of pure whim, was about to provoke. Winston's revelation hung in the gym air like an electric charge, completely changing the atmosphere. What was once a stage for humiliation had now become a powder keg. Arthur Donovan, pale, looked at his daughter, who continued to pose for the cameras, oblivious to the bomb that had just detonated a few feet from her. He then turned to Kesha. The image of the huddled, frightened girl shattered in his mind, replaced by the figure of a lightning, a fearsome fighter forged in the brutality of survival. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the promise made to her mother, the pain of present humiliation, and the dormant fury Winston had just awakened. The businessman, for the first time in a long time, felt the chill of fear. It wasn't fear of a lawsuit, but the primal fear of witnessing something he couldn't control, a force of nature his daughter was about to poke with a short stick. He made a discreet signal to the trainer in the ring, a gesture to cancel everything, but it was too late. Kesha's dignity had already been publicly torn to shreds. Winston walked to the ring, and the security guards, now hesitant after the change in their boss's demeanor, made way. He didn't climb in, but instead gripped the ropes and spoke to Kesha in a rapid, low Jamaican patois, a language of home, of shared pain and love. Kesha, little lioness, I know your promise. Your mother wanted you to have peace, but she would never want you to let them step on your honor. Look at them, he said, nodding his chin towards Victoria and her audience. They don't see you. They see an object, a joke, fighting. For money to eat was a necessity. Fighting today for your respect is a choice. Show them who you are, not the lightning of Kingston who fought out of desperation. Show them Kesha Campbell who fights for herself. Her uncle's words were the permission her soul needed. Kesha closed her eyes for an instant. The image of her mother, frail in bed, blended with Victoria's mocking face. The promise wasn't about not fighting. She understood in that moment. It was about why to fight. She opened her eyes, and the fear was gone. In its place, there was an eerie calm, the tranquility that precedes the storm. She nodded to Winston, a firm gesture, and turned to Victoria, who was looking at her with irritation. "I'm ready," Kesha said, and her voice for the first time did not tremble. The sound of the gong echoed through the silent gym, a sharp sound that began the spectacle. As expected, Victoria charged with the fury of a hungry lioness. She didn't want to fight, she wanted to annihilate. A flurry of powerful, fast punches cut through the air, each with enough force to fell an experienced opponent. The crowd of cell phones followed every movement, ready to capture the moment the girl from the ghetto would kiss the canvas. But the moment didn't come. Kesha neither retreated nor cowered. Instead, she danced. Her feet, which had seemed stuck to the floor by shame, now barely touched the mat. She moved with a supernatural fluidity, a sway of hips here, a tilt of the head there. Victoria's punches, telegraphed by her anger and arrogance, passed inches from her face, meeting only vacuum. The world champion, the queen of precision, was fighting smoke, a ghost that refused to be touched. Frustration began to appear on her face, her breathing growing heavier, her confident smile transforming into a snarl of pure perplexity. The murmuring in the audience shifted from excitement to confusion. At the beginning of the second round, Victoria's patience had completely run out. Blinded by rage and the humiliation of not being able to hit that nobody, she abandoned technique and resorted to brute force, throwing a wild and desperate right hook, a blow that left her entire body exposed for a fraction of a second. And that fraction of a second was all Lightning Campbell needed. Like a bolt of lightning, Kesha stopped her evasive dance and exploded forward. It wasn't a punch, it was an equation of pain. A left jab, quick as a snake bite, struck Victoria's solar plexus, stealing the air from her lungs with a hollow sound. Before the champion could process the pain, a precise right landed squarely on her floating rib, sending a wave of agony through her body. To finish, a left hook cracked against her chin. It wasn't the strongest punch Victoria had ever taken, but it was the most surprising. Her eyes widened in pure shock and pain. She staggered backward, no longer an arrogant goddess, but just a dazed fighter, looking at the calm, focused girl in front of her, as if she were seeing her for the first time, not a victim, but a patient predator who had just shown her fangs. The dynamic in the ring had inverted so brutally and completely that the spectators' brains could barely keep up. Now it was Kesha who walked forward, with an eerie calm, her feet firm on the ground, master of every inch of that space. She was not Victoria's blind fury. She was a calculating force, a hunter who knew her prey. Her eyes showed no anger, only an intense, analytical focus, reading every spasm of fear on the champion's face. Victoria, in turn, was in a panic. Her technique, once so polished and celebrated, dissolved into a series of clumsy defensive movements. She tried to keep her guard high, but her arms felt heavy, and her mind, once so arrogant, now screamed in existential terror. She, who had never been truly tested, who always fought with the safety net of her name and status, was facing the personification of real struggle, the fight for life. Outside, Arthur Donovan watched his daughter's deconstruction, with the horror of someone watching a house of cards collapse in the wind. The silence in the gym was a testament. The joke had lost its humor, and the spectacle was now one of pure dread. Cornered, with the desperate look of an animal in a trap, Victoria made a last effort. With a scream that was more of fear than of fury, she lunged forward, throwing a combination that had neither hope nor technique. Kesha saw the attack coming a mile away. With the same fluidity as before, she dodged to the left, Victoria's punch passing harmlessly over her shoulder. And then, the lightning struck one last time. It wasn't a single blow, but the final punctuation mark of a sentence she had been writing since the fight began. A left hook to the body made Victoria double over, exposing the side of her head. And then came the final blow, a right cross, delivered not with the force of a heavyweight, but with the precision of a surgeon and the torque of her entire body. The impact was dry, resounding and definitive. Victoria's mouthguard flew in an arc through the air. Her eyes lost all focus, becoming two empty windows. There was no time to fall to her knees. Her body simply shut down, collapsing onto the canvas with the dead weight of a statue toppled from its pedestal. An absolute profound silence fell over the gym. No one applauded, no one booed. Everyone, cell phones still raised, was frozen, silent witnesses to the fall of a queen. Kesha stood still for a long moment, her chest rising and falling as the adrenaline of the fight began to dissipate. She looked at Victoria's inert body on the ground, but did not feel the euphoria the crowd might have expected. Instead, a wave of melancholy washed over her. It was the sadness of having to unearth that part of herself, the lightning she had promised to leave behind. That knockout was not a celebration, it was an exorcism. She did not see an enemy on the ground, but an empty girl, a shell polished on the outside but hollow on the inside, who had never understood what it was to truly fight. The silence in the gym was finally broken by the sound of running feet. Arthur Donovan and a trainer slid into the ring, panic plastered on their faces as they tried to revive the fallen champion. Whispers began, shocked and incredulous. Cell phones, which had previously recorded in search of cruel comedy, now documented a tragedy of pride. Kesha, with a calmness that contrasted with the chaos around her, walked to her corner, removed her gloves, and placed them on the ground with a silent finality. Like someone laying down arms after a war she didn't want to fight. The medical team arrived, and Victoria slowly began to regain consciousness. Her eyes blinked, confused, trying to focus. The first thing she saw was not the bright ceiling or her father's worried face, but Kesha's approaching figure. Kesha did not stand in a pose of triumph. She crouched down, placing herself at the same level as the humbled champion, ensuring that her next words were a shared secret, not a speech for the audience. "You wanted to teach me a lesson," Kesha began, her voice low and firm, without a hint of hatred, just the weight of truth. You mocked my home, my hunger, my dream. You thought your money and your name gave you the right to use me as a stepping stone." Victoria, dazed, tried to stammer something, but Kesha continued. "But respect, Victoria, cannot be bought. It doesn't come in a passport or a bank account. Respect is earned with character." She paused, letting the word echo in the other's confused mind. "And yours, you didn't lose it today. You just proved you never had it." With that, Kesha stood up and without looking back descended from the ring, leaving Victoria on the ground, surrounded by her team, but completely alone with the most devastating truth of any punch. The physical knockout was just the beginning of Victoria Sterling's demolition. The real blow, the one that would truly end her career, was digital and merciless. Even before Victoria was on her feet, dozens of videos of the friendly sparring were already setting the internet ablaze. The narrative was too perfect to ignore. The rich, white, arrogant world champion publicly mocking a poor, black immigrant, only to be spectacularly dismantled and knocked out. Within hours, the video went from a fight clip to a global meme, a symbol of poetic justice. The key? Hashtags, Sterling KO, and lightning strikes dominated social media. People weren't just sharing the knockout, they were sharing the story, the before and after. The image of Victoria mocking Kesha was mercilessly juxtaposed with her fall to the canvas. Her sponsors, whose brands were built on an image of inspiring strength and victory, panicked. The calls began, press releases were issued, all with the same cold corporate language, speaking of partnership re-evaluation and values that no longer align. The queen of social media watched from her luxury apartment, her empire of followers and adoration transform into a court that unanimously declared her guilty. While Victoria's world imploded in a spectacle of digital fire, Kesha Campbell's universe expanded in a powerful silence. She and Winston returned to their tiny Bronx apartment, the air still heavy with a mix of disbelief and the pain of a broken promise, but now also with a spark of vindication. Kesha had no social media to check, no agent to call. She only had the silence of her room and the weight of what she had done. But out there, the world was roaring her name. She was no longer a social experiment. She was a phenomenon. Reporters and boxing bloggers, who previously only had eyes for Victoria, now desperately dug for any information about the mysterious Lightning Campbell. She became the personification of dignity, living proof that character trumps privilege. Her story was a movie script that real life had written. The next morning, as the smell of reheated coffee filled the small kitchen, a knock sounded at the door. It wasn't the landlord collecting rent. It was a short, corpulent man wearing an expensive suit that looked out of place in that hallway. He introduced himself as Julian "Sully" Sullivan, the country's most legendary fight promoter. "Miss Campbell," he said, with a look that saw not the tired girl, but a goldmine of talent and charisma. "I think we have a lot to talk about." The kitchen table, small and with worn edges, became the stage for Kesha's biggest negotiation. Sully, the promoter, was not a man of pleasantries. He opened his leather briefcase and spread out papers that represented a universe away from that apartment. He spoke in figures with so many zeros that they seemed unreal, in televised fights, in marketing campaigns, and in a future of security and comfort. But more than that, he spoke with a keen understanding of the situation. "Look, kid," he said, looking directly at Kesha, "anyone can offer you money. I'm offering you a legacy. The world didn't just see a fighter in you, they saw a story. They saw courage. We're not going to sell you as a punching machine. We're going to build a platform for your voice." Winston, protective as a lion, analyzed every clause, but it was Kesha who made the final decision. "I accept," she said softly, "but with one condition. A portion of every prize, every sponsorship, will go to a foundation to help other girls like me, who come from places where hope is the first thing lost." Sully smiled, a genuine smile from someone who had just found a true champion. inside and outside the ring. At that moment, signing the contract with a pen worth more than all the furniture in the house, Kesha was not only securing her future, she was rewriting her past and giving purpose to every punch she had ever needed to throw. On the other side of town, in an impersonal rented apartment that smelled of fresh paint and loneliness, Victoria Sterling lived the consequence of her choices. The empire had crumbled with terrifying speed. Her father, Arthur Donovan, after a cold and brutal conversation, blamed her for the devaluation of the Sterling brand and cut financial ties, leaving her with a fraction of what she considered her birthright. Friends, who once lived in her shadow and drank her champagne, now didn't answer her calls. Social media, once her source of power, became a digital torture chamber, where every post was flooded with memes of her knockout and comments dissecting her arrogance. She spent her days in a stupor, alternating between impotent rage and a profound emptiness. What haunted her most was not the loss of money or fame, but the echo of Kesha's words. Respect is earned with character. The phrase repeated in her mind, a final verdict that stripped her of any excuse. She, who had always defined herself by what she had, was now forced to confront what she was. And the answer she found in the silence of her new, mediocre apartment was nothing. 2 years passed, and Kesha Campbell's name had become synonymous with excellence and integrity in the boxing world. As Sully had promised, she was not sold as a savage, but as an artist of the fight. Undefeated, she won the world title with a display of technique so pure and defensive that commentators nicknamed her the Untouchable. Each of her fights was a lesson, proof that the most devastating strength is intelligence. However, her greatest victory did not happen under the spotlights of Las Vegas, but in community gyms in forgotten neighborhoods from the Bronx to Kingston. The light of Kingston Foundation was now a pulsating reality, offering not only boxing training but also scholarships, psychological support, and above all, a safe haven for young people who, like her one day, felt invisible. Kesha was not a distant donor. She was present, lacing up the gloves of a 14-year-old girl, teaching her to keep her guard up in life and in the ring. Her presence living proof that one's origin does not have to dictate their destiny. She had become exactly what her mother had dreamed of, a builder, using the strength that once served to survive, now to build futures. One cold autumn night, as she was leaving one of those gyms in the Bronx, a figure huddled in the shadows called out to her. The voice was a husky whisper, almost unrecognizable, but Kesha recognized it immediately. It was Victoria Sterling. Time had been cruel to her, or perhaps just fair. The shiny blonde hair was dull and unkempt, the designer clothes replaced by a generic, worn coat. There was no more arrogance in her posture, only the weight of years of humiliation and irrelevance. I needed to ask you," Victoria stammered, avoiding Kesha's gaze. How did you do that? I had everything, trainers, money, fame, and you broke me as if I were nothing." Kesha looked at her, and for the first time, felt a pang of compassion for the woman who tried to destroy her. There was no more anger, only a serene understanding. She took a step closer, her voice soft but clear amidst the cold street wind. "The answer is simple, Victoria. You always fought to defend the things you had. I always fought to defend the only thing I was. When you lost your things, you lost yourself with them. I, even when I had nothing, still had myself. That's why I'm still standing." Kesha's words fell on Victoria with the weight of an avalanche, demolishing the last ruins of her former identity. In that moment, under the faint light of a street lamp in the Bronx, the ex-champion finally understood. It wasn't superior strength or a secret technique that defeated her. It was her own emptiness. She had spent her entire life building a castle on the sand of arrogance, and one wave of true adversity was enough for everything to crumble. Without another word, Victoria turned and walked away, her silhouette dissolving into the darkness of the night. There was nowhere left to go, no one left to blame. She was no longer a villain, not even a rival. She was just a ghost, a cautionary tale about how privilege, when not accompanied by character, can become the loneliest of prisons. Her journey would not end with a spectacular redemption, but with something perhaps more real, the long and silent process of trying to find something within herself worth saving. Kesha watched her go, the steam of her breath mingling with the cold air. There wasn't a hint of triumph in her heart, only the deep calm that comes with the closing of a painful cycle. That conversation, more than any knockout, was her final victory. It was proof that she no longer needed the clenched fist of lightning to defend herself. Her strength now resided in her calmness, in her compassion, and in the clarity of who she was. As she walked back into the warm light, coming from the gym where the next generation of fighters awaited her, she felt the last weight lifted from her shoulders. She had faced her greatest opponent, the personification of the injustice that haunted her, and she defeated her, not by lowering herself to her level of cruelty, but by elevating herself with the strength of her dignity. That night, Kesha Campbell won twice. Once in the ring, 2 years ago for her career, and once on that dark street for her soul. A year later, the Kingston sun shone brighter than usual. It shone over the new Light of Kingston, Center of Excellence, a modern building with a state-of-the-art ring, classrooms, a library, and a cafeteria that served hot, free meals. Kesha was at the center of it all, not as a distant celebrity, but as the soul of the place. She cut the inauguration ribbon alongside a openly weeping Winston, tears of pride tracing a path on his work-worn face. The center was not just a building, it was a living monument to her journey. It was her mother's promise transformed into brick and mortar. It was a place where young Jamaicans could learn to fight for their dreams with books and gloves, knowing that hunger wouldn't await them at home. With every child's laughter echoing through the hallways, with every young athlete discovering their own power, Kesha's legacy solidified, far more enduring than any champion's belt. Her impact reverberated beyond the walls of her foundation, subtly changing the culture of the very sport that embraced her. The Kesha Way became a term in boxing. It meant fighting with a silent ferocity, with respect for the opponent, and with a dignity that didn't need insults to assert itself. Promoters noticed that their pupils' fights sold more when the narrative was about overcoming and skill, not about hatred and disrespect. Other champions began to talk more about their own journeys, about mental health, about what it meant to be a role model for others. Kesha Campbell, the girl who was called a social experiment, had in fact conducted an experiment. She proved that humanity was not a weakness in the world of fighting, but rather the greatest of strengths, a force capable of inspiring millions and transforming a brutal sport into a platform for grace. There was a house, nestled in the hills overlooking the Caribbean Sea, that Kesha bought for Winston, but where she kept a room just for herself. It was her sanctuary. On a quiet afternoon, with the sea breeze coming through the window, she was sitting on the veranda, holding an old, worn photograph. It was the only photo she had of her mother. In it, the woman smiled, a glimmer of hope in her eyes, despite the obvious fatigue. Kesha traced the outline of the face in the photo with her finger. There were no cameras there, no fans, no reporters. There was only silence and a conversation happening in her heart. "I did it, Mom," she whispered to the breeze. "I used strength as you asked, not to break, but to build. I hope you're proud." A deep peace, more valuable than any prize. Money filled her. The girl who fought for a plate of food in the alleys of Kingston had finally found her true prize: tranquility. The world saw her wealth, the cars, the multi-million-dollar contracts. But the omniscient narrator, who knew the truth of her soul, knew that money was never the goal. Money was the tool. It was freedom from worry, the ability to ensure that Winston never had to work to exhaustion again. It was the power to transform an idea, the foundation, into a real force for good. Kesha lived a comfortable but simple life. Her greatest extravagance was security. The security of knowing that bills were paid, that there was food on the table, and that the doors that opened for her were now doors she could keep open for others. She tamed the beast of capitalism, using it for her own noble ends, never allowing it to possess her. Her true treasure was not in the bank, but in the freedom it provided her to be exactly who she wanted to be. And so, the story of Victoria. Sterling became a moral tale, whispered in elite circles, a lesson about how arrogance is a disease that consumes the host from within. Her name became synonymous with downfall, a reminder that the top is a dangerous place for those without foundations. She, who was born with everything, ended up with nothing because the things she possessed were external. She adorned herself with fame and money, but underneath there was no substance. Her story serves as a dark mirror, reflecting the truth that privilege without empathy is a hollow shell, and that mocking another person's struggle is the fastest way to be forced to face your own, unprepared and alone. Her glass castle was not broken by a punch, but by the simple and unbreakable truth of another person's character. On the other hand, Kesha Campbell's journey became a hymn for the underestimated, for the invisible, for those who are judged before they even have a chance to speak. She taught us that dignity is an armor that cannot be bought, only forged in the fire of adversity. She taught us that the wounds of the past can become the source of our greatest strength, and that silence sometimes is the most powerful answer. The best revenge against those who humiliate you and tell you that you are nothing is not to destroy them. It is to build yourself into everything they said you could never be. Kesha not only bounced back, she redesigned the board, proving that true power is not in how high you can climb, but in how many people you can lift with you. The final image that defines her saga is not of Kesha raising a gold belt with a delirious crowd in the background. It is a much quieter and more meaningful image. It is the end of an afternoon at the light of Kingston Center. Kesha is in the ring, but this time she's not facing a world champion. She is training with a 13-year-old girl, thin, with eyes full of that challenging fire Kesha knew so well. The girl throws a clumsy combination, and Kesha parries the blows softly, correcting her posture with a patient smile. In that moment, she is not the champion, the legend, or the phenomenon. She is a mirror, reflecting hope back to a younger version of herself. The cycle of violence and despair that created her was broken. In its place, she began a new cycle, a cycle of opportunity, mentorship, and faith. And so, the story is complete. The lightning that once struck Kingston out of necessity and Manhattan out of honor no longer needed to be a storm. She had become the light itself, a constant and warm presence that not only found her own way out of the darkness, but now dedicated herself to illuminating the path for all those who came after her. The girl who fought to survive became the woman who taught others to flourish, and that, in the end, was her greatest and most indisputable victory.